They chased me up here so fast I didn't get a chance to finish my ice cream. Dirty deal. So now, ready?
Members of the Commonwealth Club, let me call to your attention that tomorrow at the Palace Hotel we will hear Dr. Mildred McAfee Horton, President of Wellesley College and former National Director of the Waves. Her subject will be, "Can we eliminate prejudice?" It's a ladies' day, ticket luncheon. Today, we are to hear a discussion, the case against universal military training by General Herbert C. Holdridge, retired. General Holdridge served as Plans and Training Officer, Adjutant General's Office, World War II in France and World War I. Former Commandant, Adjutant General's Office, Fort Washington, former Assistant Professor of History at West Point. General Holdridge is at this time the chairman of the People's Party and is a prospective candidate for president on the Democratic ticket. I have great pleasure in presenting to you General Holdridge.
Mr. Chairman and gentlemen, I should like to approach this problem of universal military training from the high level of public policy. We cannot isolate universal military training from our foreign policy because it is part of the armed forces policy, our military policy, which in turn must be an instrument of our foreign policy for the enforcement of any foreign policy we have. This is not a question, then, to be decided by the military. This is a question to be decided by the people themselves and by the Congress, the representatives of the people. From this point of view, I think we should be we should ask ourselves very questioning the manner in which this is being done. First of all, if this is a matter of general interest to the people, it should be of primary interest to the 18-year-old boys. There's a great deal of opinion to the effect that if boys of 18 are fit to fight for their country and die for their country, they have a right to vote. And therefore, on an issue as great as this, probably these 18 and 19-year-old boys might be asked their opinion. But no one has ever asked them their opinion. They are told that this will be good for them. So you should inquire who says this will be good for the boys. It is the Army that says so, and not the American people nor the Congress. We'd like to see these things done in a democratic manner, by a democratic process. But no one has asked the parents. The parents have never been given information upon which they could make a decision. They have been denied information upon which they could base a decision. There has been a positive propaganda campaign that has been going on now for over 2 years to sell the parents of the United States on the idea that universal military training must be passed. And those who oppose the program have been denied the right to express their opinion. I myself happen to be one of the few Army officers who has gone out to lecture against it. Not that many Army officers are not on the same side of the fence that I am on, but because I go out before the people and try to tell the people about it, I am followed from city to city, and I find that fear and intimidation meet me wherever I go. And that is not according to our democratic processes. The people have a right to know. Even if I were 100% wrong and the people wanted to hear me, then I should be given that right freely to speak before the people. And that is a right that I have insisted upon having. The Committee of Congress at the present time, which is considering this measure, never listened to all of the opposition. Many groups and individuals representing millions of American people tried to oppose it, and the Committee of Congress never gave them that opportunity. The present bill, which is before Congress, had not even been printed, and many members of that committee never even read that bill before they submitted it to the Congress, where it is now lying before the Rules Committee. When the Congress itself gets in touch, receives that bill, the members will not have full information upon which to base a decision, because they in turn are not given access to the opposition. The Army leadership, the military forces leadership, has access to all the members of Congress at any time. The Armed Forces lobby, which doesn't register at all, it is always finds all of the doors of the congressional offices open to it, and it gives only one slanted idea on the subject. So all in all, the means by which this is being done, through propaganda, backed up by many of the big newspaper chains, I think itself constitutes a danger to the American way of life. Because after all, the impetus of the propaganda, as we see it at least, comes out of the Pentagon building. We fought the British because the redcoats were being quartered on the families. We didn't like the military in the home. But now, at last, we find the domestic and foreign policies of the entire government being dominated by the military in the State Department and in the Pentagon building. So I say from that point of view, we should be very, very much on our guard as to the means by which this has been presented to the American people. The propaganda campaign, which has been very effective, comes from a basic fear and guilt complex which the armed forces are trying to impose upon the American people. They say we were not ready for World War I and World War II. That was the fault of the Congress and the American people. And then they make a flying leap to universal military training as the answer. I want to discuss presently the guilt complex of who was responsible for it, but first let me take up this question of how far universal military training will go to give us the security which they say we must have. Anyone who has considered this problem at all must consider it from the point of view of whether or not it will give us national security. The Compton Commission itself has stated very emphatically that that is the only justification for this program. National security. So let's consider it from the standpoint of national security as a military analysis, as I might make it and as many other Army officers have made it. We must consider the kind of a war we're going to have. And I don't think there's any doubt in the minds of anybody here today of the kind of a war we're going to have. The Army has admitted the kind of a war we're going to have. It will be a sudden, devastating attack, followed by an equally sudden and devastating counterattack, at the end of which time both sides will probably be prostrate. General Groves estimated that there would be 45 to 60 million dead in the first attack, the first few hours. The same thing would be true, of course, if we attacked Russia. Millions of dead, and then progressively we keep piling it on until we don't know how far we can go in destroying human life. Captain Zacharias of the Navy has pointed out that even without the atomic bomb, the weapons of mass annihilation which are presently available are adequate to destroy every form of life on this planet. It is very easy to destroy life. It has taken all of our medical profession, all of our scientists to keep people alive in the face of epidemics. And now if we suddenly reverse the process and use germs and the radioactive materials and atom bombs and all the rest of it, it's very simple to destroy most of the life on this planet, surely. It will be a short, sudden, devastating war. If we are attacked, we will retaliate against Russia. If Russia is attacked, she will retaliate against us. But we may never know who hit us. It may not be Russia at all. It may be the Nazi down in Argentina, and there are 90,000 of them down there with plenty of scientists who could develop germs to destroy us. Or it might be the Republic of Panama, because there are some very fine tropical diseases that could be brought out and used to destroy human life. The next war will be prepared and fought in the laboratories and not on the battlefields. That is the kind of a war we must envision. as realists. I am not talking about a push-button war. No one on the side that I'm maintaining has ever used that term, a push-button war. I'm talking about the weapons now in being, the things that came out of World War II, I should say, and increased in effectiveness. So that is the war. Now, how does UMT how can it be related to that kind of a war? Well, it cannot. And I can show it out of the words of the Army leaders themselves. General Marshall appeared before the Committee of Congress and stated that these men who were being trained at UMT would only be a partially trained reserve, that we would require 6 months to a year to mobilize them, and another 6 months to a year to retrain them to make them effective. Now, there's anywhere from 6 months to 2 years time required to make those reserves effective in combat. And we have a question of days or weeks, and that's all. General Eisenhower says we have a leeway of 60 days. 60 days. Who would give the order for mobilization if the Pentagon building goes out? And that's target number one, the nerve center. Everything centered in Washington, the government, the Pentagon, the Army, and the Navy, and all of it. And if Washington goes out and the Pentagon goes out, there may never even be an order for mobilization. The reserves will be in the big cities. That's where the mass of the population is. They will go out, they will be dead. The rail centers in the big cities will go out. You couldn't move trains through those centers to bring the boys together, to assemble them. And if you assemble them, they would be duck soup for the next attack. A very fine target, and be wiped out in the next round. So from this standpoint of reserves alone, it does not make sense. That one argument cuts the ground out from the entire discussion. Let me go on with the other arguments that have been presented, and I've heard them all. I've debated this thing now for 2 solid years against the best that has been brought up on it. Congressmen, senators, regular Army, National Guard reserves, American Legion, and all of them. So I'll list them to you one by one, and I don't think I'll forget many of them. Next to the reserve argument comes the question of invasion or repelling invasion. They say we must have troops available to invade. Finally, we must go in with the man with the bayonet in the mud. The war, they say, will be fought in the mud. That argument was stressed again in a Washington paper about 3 weeks ago in connection with the discussions of who's going to get the billions. And the ground forces say they need the billions because the war will always be fought in the mud. But I should like to call your attention to the fact that General MacArthur disproved that theory. He used the gasoline bomb, and he marched into Japan standing up, a grand parade. There was no invasion. These same ground force leaders insisted it would take 1 million casualties to take Japan. And there were no such casualties because he went in without firing a shot, and he bypassed 3 million of the best Japanese foot soldiers in China, and then we had to go back and haul them back home. So that theory is no longer true. You cannot use them to invade. You don't need to use them to invade. After we had saturated Russia or any prospective enemy with these new weapons, radioactive materials or germs or whatnot, we wouldn't dare go in there. The ground would be untenable, just the way it used to be in the World War I with gas. After you saturated an area with gas, you couldn't go in on top of that gas. And that's one of the reasons gas was not used in this last war. It made the ground untenable for the attacker as well as the attacked. So we wouldn't dare go in. One bomb at Bikini saturated that little area so nobody can go back now. And within a week, you had radioactive material on the west coast here in San Francisco from Bikini, according to Dr. Hutchins of Chicago. The same thing would be true if an enemy saturated us. Why come in? Why take those losses himself when all he has to do is to dump some more germs or some more radioactive materials? So you can't use them to invade or to repel invasion because there will be no invasions necessarily. Then they talk about using them for disaster forces. I want to point out that the Army did not talk about disaster forces originally, and they're not talking very much about disaster forces now. I think I used the term publicly on the platform first, but it was not original with me. That term came from General Hugh Drum, who is now in charge of the National Guard of the state of New York. And he has been training the National Guard of New York State for disaster because, gentlemen, that's exactly what we're going to have. We're going to have disaster. And you cannot train in disaster force techniques at Army camps with 18-year-old boys. If you are going to talk about another war, which will mean disaster at home because we're certain to suffer retaliation, then we should start training now at home on our own home front using adults, men and women, as well as boys and girls. You must train them on the job in hospitalization, decontamination, first aid, in water supply, and you're going to be very, very thirsty, in sewerage, in electric lighting, and things of that nature. The Army has no techniques. It has no instructors. It couldn't possibly teach those disaster force techniques at these UMT camps. It would be a wastage of that manpower, a defeating of the purpose for which training is being given to send them to camp for that particular function. Then they say we're going to use them we're going to give technical training for the kind of a technical war we're going to fight. But the kind of a technical war the Army has in its mind is the kind of a technical war we had in World War II, and not the kind of a technical war we're going to have in World War III. The technical war of World War III will be a war of the new weapons of annihilation, the atomic bomb and germs and so forth. It will be a striking force, very secret, hidden away, where no one knows it. Surely we have that striking force now, and if we don't, there is some neglect of duty on the part of our high command. I can very well imagine that MacArthur has a striking force in a stockpile of atom bombs in Japan, and that Clay has the same thing in Germany. And there is your striking force, and that is the kind of a technical force you're going to build. But you don't dare teach those techniques to these 18-year-old boys. That would be treason. And anybody who revealed those secrets would be shot. The only kind of techniques that you can teach in those camps are the techniques of the rifle and bayonet and machine gun and tank and a few radar and so on, some of the minor techniques. That is all that the Army has proposed for these camps. I heard those Army officers testify before the committee, pleading with Congress to preserve the training facilities of World War II so they would not be wasted. Bayonet, they said, and machine gun, and the rifle, and the tank courses, and so on. All of the paraphernalia of World War II. And then I want to point out that the Army couldn't even teach in the advanced techniques of World War II. The Army emasculated our colleges, took away the professors and put them in the ranks, took away the students and put them in the ranks. And then they discovered they needed doctors and they needed engineers and experts in electronics and all the rest of it, and they had to rebuild the colleges, and the Army and the Navy sent back those same boys and trained them at the taxpayers' expense. They defeated their own purpose in World War II, and they would be defeating their own purpose by this kind of training in UMT. The next argument is the question of defending the home. They use that argument. These boys, they say, will defend the home. I wish that were true. I live in Washington, in the center of the bullseye of target number 1. And around my house march these ROTC boys of Western High School, the crack ROTC organization of Washington, D.C. And they have the .30 caliber rifle. And there is the same basic training that they would receive at the camp. And they give us no security. They give me no security at all. They cannot defend anybody there any more than our ground forces in Philippines had any protection in those ground forces when the Japanese flyers came over and smacked them on the ground, and all they could do is to throw their guns up in the air and break their hearts. There is no protection of the home. They say this is a peace plan, a plan for peace. This must, in its very nature, be a plan for war. Otherwise, there's no justification. We're getting ready for war if we use this. Otherwise, we shouldn't do it. They say it will make large standing armies unnecessary. This is supposed to reduce the size of the regular army. I want to point out to you that back in 1937 and 38, when we had about 220,000 regular army, we thought 220,000 was a pretty good size standing army. Now we have an authorized army of 1,070,000. And suddenly that's supposed to be very small. To me, that's a good size standing army. And UMT will increase the size of that army if we apply the ratio of instructors and overhead to students as it exists at Fort Knox at the present time, 5 to 6, 5 overhead to 6 students, and you apply that to the kind of training we're going to have for 1 million boys or 800,000, you can see it's going to increase the size of the standing army and not reduce it. I think those are the arguments, the basic military arguments that have been presented. I don't think I have missed any. If I could find a single one that would stand up, I would tell you so because I would think it my duty to tell you so. In my opinion, this is a tremendous military blunder, more serious than the blunder of Pearl Harbor. And I want to try to explain to you now why that has come about. Why does the Army do this? I think the Army got itself out on a limb and doesn't know how to get back off that limb. I heard the testimony before the committee early in 1946, and after General Willard Paul, who is now a 3-star general and in charge of the personnel of the Army, after he had testified before the committee, I met him in the hall. I'd known him, sat next to him next to his desk in the War Department. I said, Willard, you're doing this wrong. You have not made your estimate of the situation. What you should do is to determine first your weapons, then your techniques, and then your manpower. But I said, you're doing just the reverse. You're asking the people of the country for all of the boys, all of them. Then you say you're going to teach some of them this technique and some of that, and you know most of them are obsolete. And then finally you're going to get around to determining the weapon. And he said, I know, but we have to have this now. And I think that is the key to the entire program. They were trying to catch the American people off base at the time the war fever was high, when they thought they could get it through and slip it over, and now they've got themselves in an untenable position and don't know how to get back off it. They tell me that I am not qualified because I was not a fighting soldier to testify in opposition to universal military training. And then on the other hand, they get a group of civilians, the Compton Commission, and sit behind the Compton Commission and quote the Compton Commission back at you. I want to give you a summary of these experts who are determining the policy for you. I want to make it very clear, I am not condemning these men as men. They're fine people individually, men of integrity. But these are the men that are making decisions. They are the experts. They tell me, if you're going to have an operation, you go to a skilled surgeon and you don't go to an amateur. But I want to tell you about these skilled surgeons because it has a bearing on for the future, and that's the only reason I mention it. We were not ready for World War I or World War II. I want to try to help fix the guilt, the responsibility. It was not the fault of the people or Congress, in my opinion. First of all, let's start with the Lewis machine gun. An American, before World War I, had invented the Lewis machine gun. He tried to peddle that to our Army, and our Army would have none of it. And he finally turned it over to the British, and when World War II came on, we had no machine guns. I was a cadet at West Point, and I fired one burst of machine gun fire from a borrowed Chauchat machine gun borrowed from the French. We let that get away from us, a new weapon which gave tremendous firepower. I was a cadet at West Point 3 years after war broke out, and I was taught not one single thing for fighting a modern war. We did get something on trench warfare, but all of our examples came out of the Civil War concerning the entrenchments around Richmond and Petersburg. I got down to Texas as a cavalryman. I'd chosen the cavalry from a branch, and for 1 year we worked desperately to get ready for war. We were on the priority list. I want to tell you about the most thrilling experience in my life. Got down there, and one of the first maneuvers I ever attended, I'd only had one cavalry drill as such, all the while I was a cadet. And I got down there, and they marched out these 3 full war-strength regiments 10 miles onto the mesa east of Fort Bliss. And out there we lined up in line with the flags flying and the guidons fluttering in the breeze. And then we took up the walk and the trot and the gallop and the charge, and we ended that charge with screams with the saber. And the thrill went up and down my spine. It was beautiful. The last mass charge of our American cavalry, I think. But it had no military significance. Not any. After working one solid year down there, we were all pulled off the priority list for overseas because cavalry was obsolete. I was sent to West Point and I sat out the war there as an instructor in social sciences. But we kept the cavalry till 1946. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on cavalry so that National Guard and regular Army officers could ride and play polo. More money was spent in the National Guard in 1937 for forage for animals than was spent for air power in the National Guard. Then we started getting ready for World War II. And the great blunder was made when we emasculated the revolutionary weapon that came out of World War I, air power. There was a weapon for which we were ideally suited. We had the young kids who could fly, as they showed in this last war, the best flyers ever were. We had gasoline, and most European nations had no gasoline. We had an industry to build the best planes, as the industry showed it could do. And we had, strangely enough, inspired, forward-looking leadership in Billy Mitchell and all of the people he had gathered around him. The people who knew the score, who saw this thing. Well, what happened? We know they tried Billy Mitchell, broke his heart, and he died. But worst of all, they took that new revolutionary weapon and they shackled it to the speed of the 3.5 mile per hour marching infantry division that fought in the mud. In 1937 and 38, I was a student at the Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth. And we were still handling the 3-inch map, the Gettysburg map, and when we made an envelopment, a wide envelopment with these foot soldiers, we marched as far as 15 miles or 20 miles. That was wide. I used to think I could spit that far. And then the instructor, General Brereton, came in with his maps on strategic bombing. And he had to do it almost apologetically, and the maps were almost as long as this table, and from the coast of Maine to the Mississippi River. And we plotted strategic bombing, knocking out industries and bridges and all that sort of thing. I quote this because just to show that these men did know the score. They had the picture on air power. We finally started to develop some air power, but it was under the leadership of Congressman Collins of Mississippi. He fought tooth and nail against the Horse complex. He tried to force the Army to take air power. He was the one who started the flying fortresses. He was the one who got the mechanization idea put across. And our former Chief of Staff, General Milton Craig, according to a report I read the other day, while he was still Chief of Staff, he said the World War II would be won with mules. There is the psychology of the group. Now, we went into World War II, in my opinion, with the wrong kind of armament. We started to train with these ground forces, divisions and divisions and divisions, having emasculated our new grand weapon. And we made mistakes. These same experts made many mistakes. General MacArthur, when he retreated into the rat trap of Bataan, thinking that Corregidor was strength, the same old Maginot Line complex thinking Corregidor was strength when Corregidor was weakness. And so we got hit. Because in 1936, I was in the Philippines, and we practiced that maneuver, and everybody knew exactly what we were going to do, including the Japanese. What they should have done, looking back on it now, maybe I'm a Monday morning quarterback, but they could have scattered to the jungles the way the Filipino guerrillas did and carried on an indefinite war. But after MacArthur made that initial mistake, he did something rather remarkable, and I think he emerges as one of the great military leaders of the war. He coined a new military maxim, and that was the only purpose of the ground forces is to advance the bomber line. And that is the way he fought that war. Everyone thought he was going to chase the Japs out of island after island after island, but he didn't. He bypassed island after island. He would select a base, come down on it with his bombers and his ground forces, take it, make another long end run, come down on another base, and when he finally got on top of Japan, it was all over. Then he got to the head of the snake, and he hit the snake's head and killed it. The strategy on the Eastern Front was just the reverse. There, the bomber line was used to advance the ground forces. They had built up this tremendous tonnage, and they had to do something with it. It was like a child at Christmas time with a toy that he winds up, and then he has to clear away a space under the Christmas tree to set it down. So that they had to load those troops on transports and take them to Africa because there was a good battlefield, and they took their losses. Then they loaded them up, and they went to Italy and took tremendous losses in Italy. Then they came back to England, and finally into Normandy. And General McNair himself was killed by the air power used as a flying artillery. And yet, after all of the Normandy invasion, and when we got up into Germany, a civilian committee went up to that country, and they found that Germany had received her mortal blow by air before the Normandy invasions. Eisenhower was cutting off the tail of the snake, and he was not hitting it in the head, although he was closer to the head than MacArthur ever got. Now, I don't recite these things merely to discredit the military leadership. That is not my purpose. But these same individuals now come before you for UMT. MacArthur, who was on the court that tried Billy Mitchell, Marshall, who trained in the doughboy techniques at Fort Benning at the infantry school, Bradley, who succeeded down there, all of the members of the first string team or the second string team who participated in the emasculation of air power now come along and tell you we need UMT for national security. And they're trying to build the same kind of divisions. They still talk about divisions and marching men and winning wars in the mud. In the face of these new weapons of terror, which it seems to me are very conclusive, and to my mind, as being the ultimate. So, in final conclusion, I want to say, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many people, and I'm very curious to know General MacArthur's opinion on this because he has never come out for UMT. My guess is, and according to information received, he is opposed to it. And I'm waiting till he returns to find out what his stand will be. But there is no justification for UMT from the standpoint of security. It gives us the same old Maginot Line sense of security which will lead to our undoing. Having disposed of that, let me go on very briefly to some of the other angles that appear in this picture. The Army says it is not going to stress the social byproducts. But yet, wherever I go, I find that my opponents do bring out these social byproducts. They've all been carefully briefed because so many of them have been taken to Fort Knox to find out about it. And incidentally, as you know, Drew Pearson points out that all of this propaganda by the Army is illegal, and that there's a report before the Attorney General Clark now, which he has before him to prosecute the Secretary of the Army Royal for deliberately ignoring a law. But these men have all been very carefully briefed, and these are the arguments they present, and I'll try to summarize them very briefly for you. The one on the question of being a democratic means of running the show. The selection is democratic, it is true. And so is the selection for West Point democratic, because otherwise I would never have been there since I was a country boy. But once they get there, something else happens to them. And they will start then to indoctrinate these boys in a pattern which they have in their own minds. And that process is not democratic. The Army is not a democratic structure. It is a totalitarian, absolute structure, and the Army says it cannot be democratic. The Doolittle Board was formed to recommend a degree of democratization of the Army, and the Army approved it but has done nothing about it. The Army system of control is still a relic of the medieval days, with the officer caste, the nobility, and the enlisted vassalage, the great mass of the men. And those horizontal cleavages still exist and drive a wedge between two segments of our population which are dangerous to national unity. The Competent Commission says the purpose of this is to teach the boys to think like soldiers. That's indoctrination. And I think soldiers should think like soldiers, but I don't think that all of our American boys from now on should think like soldiers. I think that would be a deplorable thing, that we put them all in the same pattern. They say we're going to improve the health of the boys, and no doubt there will be an improvement in the health under careful management. A lot of exercise, fresh air, and regular living will increase the health. But there will also be a tearing down of the health in venereal disease, in the psychological shock, and the various elements that go to make up a camp. After World War II, we found that we had 85,000 boys who received blue discharges without honor, because of lack of adjustability to the military service, and those boys are still carry that stigma against them. They're just as definitely ruined in their lives as though they had been tried by a general court. So the Army does tear down. It hasn't too great a regard for that sort of a thing. They say they're going to sort out these men and consider. Well, let me go back to health for a moment, however. You don't start with health with 18-year-old boys. You start when they're young. You start with girls as well as boys. If you wait till they're 18, it's too late. And remember that the Army skims the cream and it throws back on society the very ones who should have the medical attention. Now going on to this next thing of segregating the boys and finding out what they are qualified for technically by classification programs and so on. I happened to set up the classification program for the Army. I helped develop the classification tests, and I taught classification procedures in the Adjutant General School to thousands of officers. And I know what happened in the Army. As late as 1943, 51% of our boys were improperly assigned. There were 10,000 American soldiers in the Air Corps who had qualifications for officer candidates doing menial work in the Air Corps. And when the Chief of Staff, G1 at that time, was told about it and asked to do something about it, he threw down a handful of papers. He said, I will have no part in any program which will hamper the commander in doing what he pleases with his men. So the Army will tell you make a great many promises, but you have to be a little careful as to whether or not it will keep those promises. It promised that the 18-year-old boys in the last war would not go into battle until they'd had a year of orientation. But within 13 months, they were dead all over the world. They never kept that promise either to the parents of the United States. They talk about morality. And I can't see how any Army camp, no matter how well organized and how well run, can replace the influence of the home and the school and society and the church and the association with boys, among boys and girls, and expect a greater degree of morality to come out of it. Army camps have been the same sort of a thing from the dawn of time, from the army of Moses and Alexander the Great. And I don't think it is possible for us to set up a moral environment which will reproduce what we have at home. The question of education is raised. They say we're going to educate these boys in fourth grade subjects. It's a sad commentary on our educational system if our children haven't had fourth grade subjects before they get into the Army camps. They say we're going to teach discipline. But I know the Army system of discipline, and that discipline gives the authority in the hand of the commander like a club with which he can hit down on the heads of his subordinates. Discipline is force in the Army. Real discipline should come from inspiration of the hearts of the people so that they want to do this thing. You can't make the Army camps disciplinary barracks. And then I think it's something of a slander against our kids. After all, those boys, 18-year-olders and 19-year-olders, did win 2 wars. And out of Second World War, they were the kids, the relic of the WPA era. So I think we should go rather slow on condemning them as an undisciplined mob that they're supposed to be. So those, I think, are the major arguments that have been raised on the social byproducts of the program. We can use UMT either for national security or as a youth movement. I think it's conclusive that it has no reality when it comes to national security. It does not add to national security. Therefore, we have to consider it as a youth movement. And in my opinion, you cannot reproduce UMT, and even if it were UMT as it is at Fort Knox, and even if that were 100% perfect as far as camps go, it would still not be desirable as a youth movement. You would end up with a Hitler youth movement, as happens so often in other countries, when generation after generation come through that same indoctrination process. If we will spend the same amount of money at home for boys as well as girls, for education, for health, for all of these things that the Army now talks about, we can do a much better job with far less money for boys as well as girls. So that won't stand up either. I should like to treat very briefly now of the place of UMT in our international policy, as a part of the international policy. It must be used, of course, as a part of our program of power politics. Not one single battalion trained by UMT could ever be taken to Russia to defeat the Russians on their own soil. Even supposing we could mobilize them, it would be almost beyond imagination that we could defeat Russia on her own soil with mass armies, because Napoleon and Hitler tried it and they were both defeated. We certainly would not try to do it with mass armies. We would not have time for it. We would use the new weapons. So UMT can serve no sound policy in international relations. General MacArthur stated he needed it because it would give strength behind his diplomacy. And when the Committee of Congress asked me about that, I said if they looked over my shoulder, they wouldn't find 30 caliber rifles or bows and arrows. They would find real strength in the new weapons. So you cannot use it there. So you have the option then of using these new weapons. I want to give you my own concrete recommendations. I don't want to end on a negative note, and this is what I have recommended regularly. I have never advocated we disarm all by ourselves. I say if we're going to talk about war, then let's talk about the best weapons of war, and let's build this striking force, first of all, around these best weapons, so that any nation in the world will know that this much at least they shall receive, so that they won't dare touch us for fear of retaliation. They know we have these weapons. We may suspect that they have, and they probably have, but they know for a certainty we have them, and we build our striking force around them. General MacArthur was quoted again as saying 100,000 men would be enough. I don't know whether it's 100,000 or 200,000, but it would be, I should think, a relatively small striking force around air power or perhaps saboteurs. Next, we should build a disaster force, and that should be undertaken, in my opinion, by the National Guard and Organized Reserves as a new mission for those forces. And that should be undertaken now. It's long past the 11th hour if we're talking about a World War III, because it takes time to train these men. Then whatever internal police forces we need, we can get by volunteer enlistments, in my opinion, if we will truly democratize the Army and give an American boy, a pride in working for that kind of a boss. If the kids won't enlist when jobs are scarce, then I think Uncle Sam should take a look in the mirror, or the Army should take a look in the mirror and find out what is wrong with the boss. Those are my 3 recommendations from the military point of view. Of course, the Army has admitted and the State Department has admitted that the only line of security is the diplomatic line. There is no longer any security in these weapons. There is no defense against these weapons. Everyone knows that there is no defense against the weapons. That is the fact. That is the knowledge we have, so that all of our talk about war and war and war is completely irrational with reference to that compelling fact. Our first line of defense must be the diplomatic line. We have reached the end, in my opinion, of the era of military power in power politics. We know that we have the weapons. The Army has admitted, according to some of the men I have debated, that we must consider Russia has retaliatory weapons. So I think we have reached the point of stalemate in military armaments. The same thing that happened in the trenches on the Western Front, complete stalemate. And we cannot get out of this stalemate by increasing the size of the weapons. If you can kill a mosquito with a small sledgehammer, you don't need to multiply the size of that sledgehammer 10 or 15 times to kill the same mosquito. And that's exactly the state in which we find ourselves. If we use those weapons, we are done. We have no choice any longer between war and peace. We have a choice only between peace and suicide. We have these weapons actually pointed at our own heads at the present time. And whoever gives the command to fire, whether it's in our country or in Russia or anywhere else, that weapon will destroy us. And I should like to close on a rather ominous note, perhaps. I noticed that the other day General Halsey agreed with me with the statement I have made for the last year, and others have made it too, of course. It was not original with me, that there was no necessity from the military point of view for the use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Our scientists pleaded with the government not to use those weapons because of the result upon ourselves, because if we ever got into a war again, it would mean that no nation would ever have to have mercy on us. In spite of that, President Truman gave the command, fire with it. Upon the recommendation of General Marshall, And General MacArthur executed that command. And those people are still in power at the present time. I think it was yesterday's paper or day before here in San Francisco, an editorial pointed out that the president might very well make the next war without a declaration by Congress or without the will of the people, because the time element would be so short. So I should like to suggest we consider very carefully what is going to be the result upon us if somebody who happens to be trigger happy, to be jittery, to be all steamed about this thing, gives the command to commence firing, because then the lights go out. This will be the final calculated risk. And if that command is given, then our civilization here in the United States and all over the world goes out. We must get back to the diplomatic line of security with understanding and goodwill by one means or another, because the alternative is annihilation. Thank you very much.